What cares when one of the most trusted news anchors in America finally reaches his breaking point with meticulously curated royal stories and rehearsed PR spin? What transpires when decades of measured diplomatic reporting give way to bold, no-holds-barred interrogation, the kind that renders a high-profile duchess utterly stunned during a live broadcast? Buckle up, because you're on the verge of discovering the answer. What took place on Good Morning America wasn't merely an interview. It was a jaw-dropping showcase of fearless journalism that had audiences nationwide scrambling to process what they'd just witnessed. If you believe you've experienced intense television moments before, prepare to rethink that assumption. Don't forget to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because what you're about to see is nothing short of explosive. There, in the immaculate Good Morning America studio, George Stephanopoulos locked eyes with Meghan Markle, and what followed was anything but ordinary. The soft glow of morning sunlight poured through the studio windows, setting what should have been the stage for a flawlessly polished interview. Cameras were live, broadcasting to millions of captivated viewers. What began as a standard press appearance was moments away from transforming into something far more unexpected. George had his research ready, his questions neatly ordered, yet there was an unmistakable shift in his presence, a quiet intensity that signaled this wouldn't be the gentle, predictable exchange many had anticipated. "Meghan, thank you for being with us today," George opened, his voice steady with a seasoned command that had cemented his reputation as a journalism icon. "I'd like to begin with a topic I know our audience is deeply interested in. You've shared your story openly, your challenges, your perspective, what you describe as your truth." The air in the room tightened. This wasn't just another interview. It was the beginning of a conversation that would leave everyone watching on the edge of their seats. But let me ask you this. When you reflect on some of the claims you've made, especially those regarding specific individuals within the royal household, have you ever considered whether your viewpoint might have been, let's say, colored by the heightened emotions you were experiencing at that moment? Meghan's poised expression flickered for just an instant, her flawlessly contoured features betraying a brief but unmistakable reaction. This wasn't the soft, introductory question she prepared for. "I'm not quite following, George," she responded, her tone measured yet carrying the faintest edge. "My truth is exactly that, my truth. I've always been intentional about sharing only what I personally lived through." George shifted subtly in his seat, the deliberate tap of his pen against the notepad creating an almost rhythmic punctuation to tension. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. This was no longer a routine interview, but something far more charged. Your personal experiences, absolutely, but personal recollections can sometimes be filtered through our emotional lens, wouldn't you agree? George pressed, his gaze unwavering. "We've all had moments where stress, exhaustion, or overwhelming circumstances might reshape how we interpret events. Given that, have you ever revisited some of your more serious claims to consider whether they could have been amplified by your state of mind at the time?" The studio atmosphere grew heavier, the silence almost palpable. Meghan's shoulders drew back slightly, her fingers interlacing just a fraction tighter in her lap, a subtle but telling shift in composure. "George," she said, her voice measured but simmering with something sharper, "what you're doing right now is precisely the kind of dismissal I face within that institution. You're implying that my memories, my first-hand encounters with racism, with being stifled, with having my mental health struggles ignored, are somehow just figment of emotion rather than documented realities I endured. That's not questioning, that's undermining." "I'm not here to gaslight you, Meghan," George countered, his tone still controlled but now carrying a quiet, deliberate intensity. "But when allegations this significant are made, it's journalism's responsibility to examine them from every angle, even the uncomfortable ones." The exchange crackled with tension, no longer an interview, but a high-stakes confrontation playing out in real time. "These aren't casual remarks. They're serious claims that demand serious scrutiny," George countered, his voice firm yet measured. "You've leveled allegations with far-reaching consequences, real damage done to real lives. The public deserves clarity when accusations this heavy are made. So let me be perfectly clear. When you discuss concerns about Archer's skin tone, you deliberately withheld the identity of the individual involved. You allowed speculation to spiral unchecked, letting an entire institution shoulder the stain of racism while keeping just enough distance to avoid direct accountability. How is that journalistically responsible?" Meghan's gaze sharpened, her usually polished demeanor showing its first visible fracture, a rawness audiences had seldom witnessed. "Wait a moment," she fired back, her voice laced with disbelief. "Are you actually implying I should have publicly identified someone, risking their safety and reputation, over a sensitive, private discussion? I chose discretion to prevent harm. That's not evasion, that's basic humanity." The air between them crackled with tension, the interview veering into uncharted territory. This was no longer about polite exchanges. It was a collision of principles, with neither side willing to yield. Handling this with dignity? Protective of who? Exactly. George fired back, his journalistic intensity now fully ignited. "Because from my perspective, it appears you were safeguarding your own version of events while showing startlingly little regard for the monarchy you joined, the family you married into, or the nation that embraced you. You can't drop bombshell allegations of this magnitude and then retreat behind the shield of protection when pressed for answers. That's not transparency, that's selective truth-telling." The studio air grew thick with electricity. Camera operators, normally focused on smooth technical execution, found themselves unconsciously edging closer. Even the usual hum of activity behind the scenes, the rustling of scripts, the quiet chatter of producers, faded into stunned silence as everyone present recognized they were watching television history unfold in real time. This wasn't just another celebrity interview anymore. It had become a cultural flashpoint playing out before millions. "George, you're twisting this narrative," Meghan countered, her polished media instinct surfacing as she fought to steer the conversation. "I was posed a straightforward question during that interview, and I responded with truth. My intention wasn't to cause harm, but neither was I willing to sacrifice my authenticity to shield a system that left me vulnerable when I needed support." George let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Left you vulnerable? Meghan, you were handed unimaginable privilege, a royal title, a global platform, round-the-clock security, and access to resources most people couldn't dream of. You were embraced into one of the most exclusive institutions in history. And when you realized that monarchy came with centuries-old expectations, rules that applied to every member, not just you, your reaction was to detonate it all in front of a worldwide audience." He paused, leaning in. "So tell me, how exactly did they fail you?" "You're reducing this to black and white terms when it's anything but—" Meghan shot back, her tone intensifying. "Having a title doesn't erase isolation. Having security doesn't negate emotional neglect. This wasn't about rules. It was about being denied basic compassion when I was struggling. If that's your idea of protection, then yes, the system failed spectacularly." The exchange had escalated beyond interview territory into something far more visceral, a clash of worldviews playing out in real time, with neither side backing down. The studio crew stood frozen, aware they were capturing television that would be dissected for years to come. "George, you can't possibly understand what it was like to exist inside that gilded cage," Meghan fired back, her voice vibrating with restrained emotion. "To have every gesture, every outfit, every private moment micromanaged. To sit silently while tabloids printed vicious lies about you daily. To watch as both your own relatives and your husband's family refused to publicly correct damaging faucets that were systematically dismantling your character." George deliberately placed his pen on the table, then turned to face the camera for a brief, calculated moment before swinging back to Meghan. "Then let's examine those so-called faucets," he said, his tone shifting into investigative mode. "Because I've done my research thoroughly, and our audience deserves factual clarity. You repeatedly stated you entered the royal family blindly, that you were given no guidance about protocols or expectations. But let's review the timeline. You and Harry dated for nearly 2 years before your engagement. You had unlimited access to global media, centuries of published material about royal duties, and an entire internet's worth of documentaries detailing exactly what palace life required. How could someone as intelligent and resourceful as you claim to have been completely unprepared?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, transforming the interview from a conversation into something resembling a courtroom cross-examination. Every word now carried the weight of unspoken implications, about credibility, about intent, about the very nature of truth itself. The studio's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as millions of viewers collectively held their breath. Are you genuinely suggesting you enter this arrangement with absolutely no awareness of what it entailed? George pressed, his tone cutting through the studio like a blade. Meghan's cheeks flushed visibly, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of a bracelet as she formulated her reply. There's an ocean of difference between academic research and lived reality, George, she countered, her voice gaining strength. You can study royal protocols for years, but until you've actually walked in those shoes, until every minor gesture, from how you sip tea to how you enter a vehicle, becomes fodder for international scrutiny and brutal criticism, you cannot possibly comprehend the psychological toll it takes. George offered a measured nod, though his piercing gaze made it clear this concession was merely tactical. Point taken, he acknowledged, but let's address some of your specific allegations head-on. You initially claimed that Kate reduced you to tears before your wedding, a narrative that, as you know, sparked global condemnation of her character. Only later did you clarify that, in fact, you were the one who made Kate cry, and that she subsequently apologized to you with flowers in hand. How do you reconcile these contradictory accounts? The question landed like a grenade in the otherwise sterile studio, its implications rippling outward. This was no longer about generalities. It was a direct challenge to the credibility of Meghan's entire narrative. The air grew thick with anticipation as viewers worldwide leaned closer to their screens, recognizing they were witnessing an interview that will be analyzed for decades to come. Here's what the public deserves to know, George pressed, his voice dropping to a deliberate, measured tone. Which account is the truth? And more critically, why did you permit the initial, inaccurate version to tarnish Kate's character for an extended period before finally correcting the record? The silence that followed was deafening, stretching far beyond the typical beats of live television. Meghan's lips parted slightly before pressing together again, a fleeting but telling hesitation, as if the words she needed were trapped between thought and articulation. George had clearly landed on sensitive ground, and he wasn't about to retreat. I'm still waiting for an answer, Meghan, he continued, his quiet intensity underscoring decades of holding the powerful to account. You stood by while your sister-in-law endured global condemnation, for months, if not years, over a narrative you knew was false. That goes beyond mere omission. At best, it's deeply irresponsible. At worst, it's calculated character assassination. For the first time, Meghan's polished facade visibly fractured. You have no idea what that period was like for me, she fired back, her voice wavering with emotion. I was drowning in wedding preparations, in relentless media attacks, in the suffocating demand to embody perfection. When that story surfaced, I was in no position to control the narrative. The palace communications team certainly didn't intervene on my behalf. Why is the burden of correction mine alone? The raw edge in her voice transformed the studio atmosphere entirely, no longer a debate, but a collision of unresolved history playing out in real time. George's next move would determine whether this became a moment of accountability or a spectacle of victimhood. The world watched, riveted. At the time, I was trying to respect what should have remained a private exchange between Kate and myself, Meghan countered, her voice tightening. I never intended to cause harm, but the damage happened regardless. George didn't relent. Let's be clear about who bore the brunt of that damage. Kate's reputation suffered. The monarchy's public image took another hit. And your own credibility? That took a direct blow when you finally clarified the truth, not as an immediate correction, but as a delayed footnote in another interview. That doesn't read as an oversight, Meghan. That reads as strategic narrative control, parceling out facts only when they suited your broader story rather than when honesty demanded it. The camera zoomed in just enough to catch the faint tremor in Meghan's fingers as she reached for her water glass. That's an incredibly unfair characterization, she shot back, her composure fraying at the edges. You're framing me as some master manipulator when the reality was sheer survival mode. Every move I made was dissected in real time. Every syllable I uttered was spun into something sinister. No matter what I did, whether I spoke up or stayed silent, I was crucified for it. There was no right way to navigate that nightmare. The rawness in her voice cut through the studio, laying bare the impossible position she'd been in. But whether it justified the collateral damage remained the unspoken question hanging between them. George let the silence linger, allowing the audience to sit with attention. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a referendum on accountability, victimhood, and who gets to control the truth. George settled back in his chair, his piercing gaze unwavering. Then let's discuss survival, because there's something I need to clarify. You shared harrowing accounts of suicidal ideation, of seeking support only to be denied under the guise of protecting the monarchy's image. That's an explosive claim. But here's what confuses me. You possessed unimaginable privilege, financial means, a devoted husband, global connections. Why did institutional approval dictate whether you sought life-saving care? Why outsource that decision to palace bureaucrats when your well-being was at stake? Meghan's eyes ignited, all diplomatic veneer shattered. You clearly don't comprehend how that system operates. Nothing happens unilaterally, not therapy, not press statements, not even a doctor's appointment. Every action requires clearance through layers of archaic protocol. You think just getting help was an option? Try existing in a gilded cage where even breathing is a political act. The studio lights seemed to intensify as George countered. With respect, that sounds less like helplessness and more like willful compliance. Harry grew up in that system. He knew its flaws. Together, you had the influence to demand exceptions. Yet you chose to weaponize the institution's failures after leaving, rather than challenging them when it might have actually reformed things for the next vulnerable person entering that world. Meghan's voice dropped to a seething whisper, spoken like someone who's never had their passport confiscated for safekeeping. We did pushback, and were met with threats about security revocation, with smear campaigns implying instability. You're blaming the prisoner for not picking the lock fast enough while ignoring the guards holding the key. The exchange had crossed into dangerous territory, no longer about facts, but about who bears moral responsibility in systems of oppression. The cameras kept rolling, capturing a confrontation that would redefine Meghan's public narrative forever. Every single decision had to be greenlit by officials who prioritized press optics over people's well-being. Meghan fired back, her voice sharp with frustration. George's eyebrows lifted in disbelief. Let me get this straight. You're saying you willingly endured psychological torment, potentially risking your life, because you didn't want to rock the boat? That doesn't align with the fiercely independent persona you cultivated in every other aspect of your public life. The studio's harsh lighting seemed to intensify as Meghan adjusted in her chair, the leather creaking faintly under the weight of the moment. You're reducing an institutional crisis to a personal failing, she countered, her words measured but simmering. When you're trapped inside that machinery, they systematically strip away your autonomy. You don't just forget your options, you're conditioned to believe you have none. The system is designed that way. George gave a slow, deliberate nod, though his piercing gaze betrayed lingering doubt. And yet, he challenged, leaning forward, when it suited your goals, whether launching lawsuits, negotiating Netflix deals, or publishing memoirs, you demonstrated remarkable independence. Why was this the line you couldn't cross? The unspoken accusation hung thick in the air, selective helplessness. Meghan's next move would either expose the monarchy's psychological shackles or reveal her own contradictions. The interview had become a high-wire act with no safety net, and the world watched, riveted, as she teetered between victim and strategist. Let's examine the facts, George countered, his tone sharpening. You actively continued your work with charitable patronages despite reportedly being advised to scale back. You kept connections with friends the institution allegedly frowned upon. You made wardrobe choices that supposedly defied royal protocol. These weren't passive acts. They were deliberate decisions demonstrating clear autonomy. So why, when it came to something as critical as your mental health, did that independence suddenly vanish? Meghan's eyes flashed with defiance as she leaned forward. That's a false equivalence, George, she fired back, her voice edged with exasperation. Advocating for causes I believe in or maintaining personal friendships isn't remotely comparable to seeking psychological care. One involves the monarchy's public image. The other concerns my private survival. The stakes weren't just different, they were incomparable. And that's precisely the issue, George pressed, his cadence deliberate. You exercise independence when it aligned with your priorities, but cite powerlessness when it doesn't suit your narrative. You can't have it both ways. Either you had agency, or you didn't. Which is it? The challenge landed like a detonation, reverberating through the studio. The unspoken question, are you a prisoner of the system or its strategist, hovered between them, demanding an answer. Meghan's next words wouldn't just shape this interview. They'd redefine her entire public identity. The air crackled with tension as the world waited for her response. Meghan's features transformed in rapid succession, first stunned disbelief, then white-hot fury, before finally hardening into defensive resolve sharper than anything the public had witnessed before. "How dare you?" she seethed, her whisper laced with venom. "How dare you sit across from me and dissect my darkest moments like some clinical case study? You've never known that crushing despair where every breath feels impossible. Never been treated as a liability by an institution that should have protected you." George remained unmoved. "You're absolutely right. I haven't. But I do recognize evasion when I see it. What I'm observing is someone who demands sympathy as a powerless casualty while operating as a global influencer with direct access to presidents and billionaires. Those two realities can't coexist. Meghan, either you were trapped or you're the architect. A career out of victimhood." Meghan's laugh was razor-edged. "Let's revisit the facts. I surrendered my acting career, my financial independence, my home country, my friendships, even strained family ties, all for an institution that then offered zero protection when the tabloids came for blood. Now you're accusing me of curating oppression? Tell me, George, what exactly should I have sacrificed more to prove my suffering was real?" The clash had escalated beyond interview territory into something far more primal, a collision of trauma and accountability, with neither willing to yield. The studio's air grew thick with electricity as millions of viewers bore witness to a confrontation that would dominate headline for weeks. "Let's be absolutely clear. I gave up everything trying to fulfill that role," Meghan countered, her voice trembling with barely restrained emotion. "And when staying meant risking my sanity, my safety, my life, I walked away. Explain to me how choosing survival makes me a professional victim." George retrieved his pen, tapping it methodically against his notes, a rhythmic punctuation to his next volley. "You departed, yes, but let's examine how you left. Not with quiet discretion, as one might expect from someone genuinely seeking peace. Not with the dignified silence the monarchy typically demands. Instead, you orchestrated a media blitz, primetime interviews, Netflix documentaries, million-dollar book deals, systematically dismantling the institution on your way out. That's not retreating to heal. That's Monetizing your exit while settling scores." The camera zoomed imperceptibly closer, capturing the tension coiling through Meghan's frame, her jaw clenched, shoulders stiff with the effort of control. Every flicker of her eyelids, every controlled breath spoke volumes beneath George's forensic scrutiny. "You're conflating two separate things," she fired back, her cadence sharpening. "Telling my truth isn't a campaign. It's reclaiming agency after years of being silenced. And if sharing my story helps others trapped in similar situations, that's not exploitation. That's empowerment." George didn't blink. Then why the selective transparency? Why monetize the pain if the goal was purely advocacy? The contradiction is a story, Meghan. The standoff had reached its zenith, no longer about facts, but fundamental philosophies of trauma, privilege, and who gets to control the narrative. The world watched, riveted, as the Duchess teetered between righteous defiance and something far more vulnerable. Someone had to correct the record when the palace let lies spread unchecked. Meghan shot back, her words clipped and tense. After being denied any official defense against false accusations, what choice did we have but to speak for ourselves? George's expression turned skeptical. Or was it about reshaping the record entirely? He challenged. "Because here's what stands out to me. Your version of events isn't just consistent clarification. It's fluid. Details shift depending on the platform. New claims emerge while old ones fade away. That's not transparency. That's strategic storytelling." The atmosphere in the studio grew almost suffocating. Meghan's fingers trembled faintly against the armrest, her breath shallow, every physical cue betraying the pressure mounting beneath her poised exterior. George, recognizing the shift, pressed harder. "Let's address the core contradiction," he said, his tone sharpening with the weight of decades holding power to account. "Your entire identity now revolves around authenticity, being a champion for truth, for the marginalized. But how does that square with a narrative that adapts over time? Can you truly be the voice of the voiceless if your own story won't stay still?" The question wasn't just a challenge. It was a direct strike at the foundation of her public persona. The cameras caught the flicker of hesitation in Meghan's eyes, the split-second lapse before her response. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. Then let's define truth, George pressed, his voice cutting through the studio like a scalpel. If critical details shift or disappear based on what suits your agenda, how much of this is genuine transparency versus calculated image control? Meghan's complexion flushed under the harsh lights, her meticulously applied foundation no match for the anger simmering beneath. My account hasn't changed, she fired back, her voice taut. What changed was my refusal to keep shielding those who watch me drown without lifting a finger. If I stopped editing myself to spare people who never spared me, that's not inconsistency, that's liberation. Ah, so now we arrive at the core, George countered, leaning in with the precision of a trial lawyer delivering a final rebuttal. This was never about truth or healing, was it? This is retaliation, ensuring that if you endured pain, they'd feel it too. Not justice, punishment. The accusation landed like a slap. Meghan's lips parted in stunned disbelief, her eyes flashing with a fury too visceral to mask. Revenge, she repeated, her voice trembling. You believe I subjected myself to global humiliation, relentless attacks, and psychological torment for vengeance? What kind of twisted? I believe you recognize a marketable narrative, George interrupted, merciless. The oppressed heroine battling the evil empire? That's not just a story, it's a brand. And it sells everything from documentaries to keynote speeches. The math is simple. Victimhood equals influence. And you've mastered the equation. The studio seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer debate. It was demolition. Every word now carried the weight of career-defining consequences. The cameras zoomed tighter, capturing the moment Meghan's fury crystallized into something far colder and far more dangerous. Books, documentaries, speaking tours, they all thrive on drama, don't they? George continued, his tone razor-sharp. And the more explosive the claims, the higher the demand. That's not journalism, that's commerce. Meghan shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the studio floor, a jarring sound that silenced the room. I won't tolerate this character assassination, she snapped, her voice vibrating with outrage. You lured me here under the guise of a standard interview when your agenda was clearly set before I even arrived. George didn't move. His composure, cool, unshaken, only amplified her agitation. I invited you for an honest dialogue, something that's been conspicuously absent in your curated storytelling. Sit down, Meghan. We're not done. Oh, we're done, she fired back, but something in his tone, an undercurrent of unyielding authority, made her pause mid-turn. The energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. This was no longer soft-focused celebrity PR. It was an interrogation with stakes neither could walk back. Sit down, George repeated, quieter now, yet infinitely more commanding, because there's one question left, and the public deserves to hear your answer. The challenge hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. For the first time, the Duchess seemed to grasp the full gravity of the moment. Every second of hesitation was magnified under the unblinking gaze of the cameras, and the world watching behind them. Meghan hovered for a suspended moment, every flicker of hesitation, every tense muscle broadcasting the war raging behind a composed facade. Finally, with visible reluctance, she lowered herself back into the chair, though her spine stayed steel straight, every inch of a radiating defiance. Let's cut to the heart of this, George said, his cadence dropping into something quieter yet infinitely more dangerous. If your claims of systemic discrimination are being silenced and sabotaged at every tone, are fact, where's the evidence? No emails, no voice memos, no paper trail from an institution that documents everything. No staff is willing to corroborate on record despite hundreds having passed through those gates. How does total oppression leave zero forensic traces? The question didn't just linger. It loomed, a guillotine poised to drop. Meghan's expression morphed in real time. First bafflement, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a flash of raw alarm as a trap snapped shut around her. This was no longer about minor discrepancies. This was about the bedrock validity of her entire narrative, and the silence where proof should have been screamed louder than any interview ever could. The studio's air grew thick enough to choke on. Even the crew had stopped breathing. Whatever came next wouldn't just make headlines. It would rewrite history. That's not how these things operate, she faltered, her usual poise crumbling under the weight of the question. These weren't formal meetings with minutes taken. They were private conversations, subtle slights, quiet exclusions. You don't document every sideways glance or veiled comment. But you do document policy, George countered, relentless. Formal requests, official denials. If you sought mental health resources and were institutionally blocked, where's the paper trail? If there were legitimate concerns raised about Archer's skin tone, serious enough to warrant global accusations, why is there no record of those discussions? The palace archives everything. Meghan, everything. Her fingers trembled in her lap, her voice shrinking to something almost fragile. You're treating this like a courtroom when these were family matters. Not every hurtful word comes with a paper receipt. Family matters. George's composure cracked for the first time, his voice sharpening. Meghan, you didn't whisper these claims over tea. You broadcast them to millions. You leveled charges of racism, systemic neglect, psychological endangerment on international television. You don't get to play the private family business's card after turning it into a global scandal. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter. Every camera zeroed in on the Duchess's face as it flickered between defiance and something far more vulnerable, the realization that a most powerful narrative might be built on sand. The silence stretched, charged, and dangerous, as the world waited to see whether she'd find solid ground or sink completely. Private grievances don't remain private when you amplify them on global platforms, George countered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. When you level accusations as severe, racism, systemic neglect, psychological harm, the burden of proof doesn't disappear just because the setting was intimate. The world listened. Now it deserves evidence. The studio had become unnaturally still. The only sounds of faint were of equipment and the collective held breath of every witness present. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a deconstruction. I have proof, Meghan insisted, but the words lacked their usual steel. My lived experience is my evidence. My truth matters. George exhaled, shaking his head with something resembling pity. Personal truth isn't universal truth, Meghan. And what's become undeniably clear today, what millions have now seen firsthand, is a pattern. You've built an empire on victimhood, commodifying pain, both real and perceived. You've burned bridges, smeared reputations, and destabilized centuries-old institutions, all while positioning yourself as a wronged heroine in a story that keeps shifting to suit the moment. For the first time, Meghan turned fully toward the camera, her gaze raw and imploring. "That's not me," she whispered, voice breaking. "That's not what this was supposed to be. I never wanted." "But it's what you made it," George interjected, merciless. "You orchestrated the spectacle. You curated the drama. And above all, you profited." The finality of his words left no room for rebuttal. The interview was over. The damage, irreversible. And the world had just watched the Duchess unravel in real time. Now the world faces a choice, George concluded, his voice resonating with quiet intensity. Will the public continue accepting your narrative at face value? Or will they begin demanding the same accountability we pursued here today? As the cameras rolled through their final seconds, they framed two starkly contrasting images. Meghan, her usual poise fractured beyond repair, sitting motionless in the wreckage of the interrogation, and George, turning to face the lens with the unwavering gaze of a journalist who just fulfilled his highest calling. No tears, no pleas, no celebrity spin had derailed him from journalism's sacred duty to interrogate power, even when it wears a mask of victimhood. The screen faded to black. But the reckoning had only just begun. What began as a standard publicity stop exploded into must-see television, a relentless interrogation that's now forcing the entire country to re-examine everything they believed about one of the world's most scrutinized women. This wasn't just an interview. It was a cultural earthquake, leaving viewers stunned, arguing, and fundamentally reassessing the narratives they've been sold for years. "Now we want to hear from you." Did George Stephanopoulos go too far, or was this the uncompromising journalism we've been missing? Which other high-profile figures deserve this same no-holds-barred accountability? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for our deep dive breakdown of every explosive moment in Part 2. The conversation's just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next.